Hi everyone, welcome to week 4. So again, this video is going to cover the main assignment, which right now is Critical Quantitative Analysis Part 1. I want to briefly repeat what I have said in class, which is that you should probably find 2 new articles for your critical quantitative analysis. This is a really important opportunity to add to your literature review for your qualifying exam. However, if there's a problem with that, for example, if you've actually already found most of the quantitative articles in your area, let me know. I'm happy to talk about it. The other thing that's not written here, but is very important, is that you can also do a mixed methods article. I think that could be, has been maybe confusing for some people that it doesn't have to be strictly or only quantitative. It just has to have some numbers in it, right? So it could be mixed methods where part of it is a survey, and that often is the case. And then finally, please add these articles to your Lit Review graphic organizer that you've been using in Dr. Strom and Dr. Gray's class. Right, so in this video, I'm going to be going over example from past classes of each area of the critical quantitative analysis. So this gives you kind of an idea of where you're headed. There are also 2 full examples available on Blackboard. One of them is very extensive, so you'll see maybe kind of the furthest reach, and then one is a little bit less so. So in terms of study design, you can see here, this is Brian's example from last year. One of the things I want to point out is that it's plain language. There doesn't need to be, you don't need to try to sound super academic or elaborate in that way. You can just talk very clearly about what this article and these authors are doing. So here, Brian says, Underwood used a mixed method study to describe the nature of parent engagement in the development and implementation of individual education plans. That is a really clear sentence, right? I already know what kind of study, what kind of method it is, and what the study's about, which is actually pretty important for me to know as I'm reading through these. And it's great because you have to write up, right? Then it used both qualitative and quantitative approaches. That's important. And then he talks about the qualitative source of the data and the quantitative component. So if it's mixed methods, you would need to talk about the 2 different sources. And in fact, any of your in this research design paragraph, you want to talk about how do they get their data? Is it survey data? Are they taking from a national database? Like, what is their data is part of how you talk about the study design. And then what's great, he does a little bit of critiquing, right? The quantitative component of the study was secondary to the qualitative component and used as a complementary reinforcement. So he's describing how this study was built. And what's so great about this is it then supports his eventual dissertation work, right? Like now in writing about this, he understands now how to write his own methods later. And in fact, Brian did do a mixed method study later. So that we understand now from looking at this that mixed methods, the one aspect can be secondary to the other aspect, and what exactly does it serve, right? These papers should write up why they're doing each thing that they're doing. The justification should be clear, and you should write up that justification in your CQA here. And of course you can critique it. So Brian doesn't critique it that much here, but you can critique, for example, if they don't justify why they use something. Okay, an example from Robin about assumptions and validity. These 2 things often go hand in hand, so I just wanted to let you know it's okay if there's some overlap either way, right? So she says, Coran's selection of the research questions as well as the instruments implies a belief that submitted data to NCES is accurate. So this is a large data aggregation system. In other words, Coran assumes that all suspensions were properly documented by principals because she is reading about suspension rates, but she is a principal, and so she understands that there exist possibilities that principals suspend students without properly submitting paperwork. So she's questioning, well, is there an issue of validity with this measure? And remember, that's what we're doing with validity. We're really looking at the measure itself. Is there some issues with validity? And so I talk about that a little bit on this slide. that were really hoping to look specifically at instruments. So the instrument they use to measure something. So whether that's a survey or a test or whatever. And we talked about that earlier in terms of Hanishek. Michelle has another example here. Since there's no clear hypothesis, theory, or agreed upon criteria for quality teaching other than credential type, the construct validity, or just the validity in general, in this analysis is limited. The lack of understanding of what makes a quality teacher and combination of what is measurable across California narrows the context in which you can discuss the craft of teaching. So she's critiquing a measure in this paper of a quality teacher, right? Like, so this paper has some number that says this is a quality teacher, and she's saying there might be some issues with validity on this. And I love this, like really starting to be critical, although I know actually all of you are very good at that already, about the methods, like really thinking about, like, as we learn about these methods, how do we be critical of these things? And or supportive, so sometimes things are very well documented. In terms of sampling, we are going to get into this a little bit later in terms of how we might really critique this, but I want to give you an example that it's still, you can still write up what happens in their sample without necessarily fully understanding this idea of sampling yet, all right? So Andrea says this study used 556 students who are 18 years of age. So very plain, simple reporting of what the sample actually was, all right? And then who these students were, 93% were from sports-oriented secondary schools and 10% with no sport profiles. And then how did they select the sample? It's very important that you write that down. These are things I want you to start paying attention to. So this is not just one sentence saying the sample was 556 students, right? How did they select it? Who were the people? Because once you start looking more deeply at these things, and once we start learning about sampling, you can start critiquing it, right? Is it best to pick them at random from 39 public schools, right? Why is it 88 students participated competitively and 368 did not? So here she's reporting this because she's not maybe learned as much about sampling yet, but she starts to think about this. This sample size, she says the sample size seems appropriate. This seems like a big sample. So that's great. She's already starting to do some critiquing. But then she says, well, what I don't know is the number of students at each school. So are these big or small schools, right? So like, if it's only, if it's 10 students out of a school of 2,000, is that really an appropriate sample? Or is it, 200 students out of a school of 2,000? Or is it, 10 students out of a school of 200, right? These would make a very big difference in whether the sample is appropriate. What percentage of the total students is 368? And then she brings up this concern of 88 and 368 as this comparison group. And I think these are appropriate concerns. So you can use your just logical sense in bringing up concerns, or again, believing, sometimes you maybe see that, yeah, this sample is entirely appropriate, or I think that it's appropriate in your write-up of this section. Okay, now the statistical analysis is probably going to be the hardest in your first go around. We will not have gotten to statistics at all. Some of you may have familiarity, others don't, and that's okay. You can see here where Robin wrote, truthfully, the statistical analysis conducted by Corinne far exceeds my statistical knowledge, and that's okay. It's okay to write that. Corinne utilized a regression, but she doesn't give up, right? She goes in and says, I'm gonna try to unpack this. He used a regression equation that contained a single indicator variable assigned to zero tolerance laws and multiple dummy variables for zero tolerance laws. So she's trying to unpack this language. And we really, in order to create a hunger for the statistics we're going to do in class, we need to dive into the language that's being used here and try to write it down. It's our first layer of seeing how this is written up so that we can understand what we need to know, right? And then she goes on to describe and actually uses a quote, which is totally fine, right? Because maybe we don't know enough to even unpack what this means, a vector of time variant district or school characteristics, all right? So she says, it's still beyond my ability to understand whether it was correctly analyzed. but it's consistent with the multitude of studies I have read on zero tolerance. That is such a great statement there, right? Because when we start to see consistency across the literature, that increases the overall validity of the study. And that's that second kind of validity, right? Validity of entire studies. So that's a really important point that you can make right now, right? Because you understand the literature. So as you read these studies, you can say, well, I may not understand the statistics, but this is consistent or it's not consistent with the literature. And it can be consistent even with qualitative findings. Okay, so that's the examples right now. Again, there are examples on Blackboard that you can pull up as well as you write this critical quantitative analysis. I want you to enjoy the process as much as you can. You know, this is just an opportunity to dive in and dig into this article and really pull it apart in a way that I know many of us skim, right? We skim the methods of quantitative articles in many cases and like, oh, I don't really know what you're talking about. So we're really going to dive in there and start to pull it apart. Now, once again, I have a few words about words to just kind of clarify as we move into things. This will be very useful for next face-to-face week when we actually have to start coming up with survey items to measure our evaluation, all right? So any measure, a test or a survey, is composed of one or more constructs. And constructs are essentially areas that are being measured. They are things like engagement, agency, content knowledge about inference, right? We looked at a test about inference. So maybe one of the things measured by the 4th grade English language arts test is inference, the ability of students to infer. That's a construct. So usually each test has several constructs. So the 4th grade language arts might measure the ability to infer, the ability to comprehend from reading, the ability to transfer that comprehension to something else, whatever, right? And then from, you can see the arrows here, that each of those constructs makes up this measure, but from each of those constructs comes a variable. So you can see the arrow running from the construct to the variable. And the variable is like a number. So I wanted to sort of clarify the relationship between constructs, measure, and variable. And people will talk about, and you'll see in their lit review, and often in the first part of their methods, they'll talk about constructs because they're talking about, you know, this area that they're trying to measure. But then by the time they get to their findings, they're talking about variables because they have turned that construct into a number through writing test items on it. So as an example, the measure might be the conditions for reform at a district, which is a test, a survey that I have created with some colleagues, all right? So the constructs within that survey might be teacher agency, the alignment of teacher values with the pedagogical principles in the reform, the principal support, and the trust among various people in the school. All right, so those are 4 constructs that we believe from the literature help to create conditions that are conducive to reform. All right, and you can see how each of those constructs can be defined within the literature. They can each be, using the literature. They each have theoretical grounding and empirical grounding. Now, each of those then would have at least 3 items on our survey. And if you're interested, I can show you this survey that I'm talking about. So teacher agency might have 3 items that measure, or we're trying to measure, well, what's their sense of ability to implement whatever reform is going on, right? Like, do they feel like they have control over their own classroom, control over curriculum, these kinds of things. So there might be 3 items or 4 that ask teachers to rate that. Then we take those 3 numbers, so maybe they put a 3, a 4, and a 3. All right, that was what they rated, those 3 things. We average across them and we get a number like 3.4. Don't hold me to it. I don't know whether 3 and 4 and 3 equals 3.4. That becomes the variable. So then when we actually input it into a quantitative model to try to test something, like maybe I want to test the relationship between teacher agency and their classroom practice. I now have this number, 3.4, and I'm going to try to relate it to another number, which has to do with their reporting on their classroom practice. Right now, you could be having all kinds of questions about the validity of all of this, which I would love to hear, but this is an example for you to understand kind of how do we construct items for a measure. We have to understand the literature, we have to define what we're trying to measure, we construct the items, and together, average together, that becomes a number, which hopefully somewhat represents that construct. Okay, final advice for part one. Remember to cite the paper properly at the top or at the bottom. And just again, a reminder to really use the number. If it says 1, study design, so don't just use the number in the title, and then write up your response below, that you don't need to write an essay format. All right, I hope you have a really lovely week, and I will see you soon.